And she chose that road to do what she does. And sometimes you hit a bump and it don't go right, so I can't sit in judgment.
Don Rickles was known as Mr. Warmth, the king of insult comedy who could make fun of anyone from Hollywood stars to presidents and still leave them laughing. He had a special gift for finding humor in any situation and making people feel good even when he was poking fun at them. But there was one story from his career that he kept quiet for many years, and it didn't have a funny ending. In his final years, Rickles finally told people about something that happened during the making of one of the most famous movies of the 1990s. It was a night that was so difficult and draining that it changed how he thought about his work. This wasn't about money or fame. It was about different types of people trying to work together, and how sometimes that just doesn't work out. The movie was Casino, directed by Martin Scorsese. This was a big deal for Rickles because it gave him a chance to step away from comedy and try something more serious. He respected Scorsese's work and was excited to be part of such an important film. He knew this would be different from his usual work doing stand-up comedy in nightclubs, but he thought it would be a good challenge. Martin Scorsese was the type of director who wanted everything to be perfect. He would film the same scene over and over again, sometimes 10, 20, or even 30 times, until he got exactly what he wanted. For actors like Robert De Niro, who was also in the movie, this was normal and even exciting. De Niro was known for his method acting, which meant he would completely become his character and stay in that mindset even when the cameras weren't rolling. But for Rickles, this way of working was torture. He was used to performing live in front of audiences where everything happened quickly. He would tell a joke, people would laugh right away, and then he would move on to the next joke. The energy was fast and exciting. On the movie says, everything moved slowly, and there was no audience to react to what he was doing. The worst night happened during filming in Las Vegas. They were working past midnight in a casino that felt heavy and stale. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, and the only sounds were the quiet hum of slot machines in the background. The crew members looked tired, and everyone was moving around like shadows between takes. Rickles, who usually kept everyone's spirits up with his jokes, was unusually quiet. The slow pace and serious atmosphere were wearing him down. De Niro was completely focused on his character and barely spoke to anyone unless the cameras were rolling. Every time they filmed a scene, he would do exactly the same movements and say his lines in exactly the same way. To the film crew, this showed how professional and dedicated he was. But to Rickles, it felt like being stuck in the same moment over and over again, with no way out. By 4 o'clock in the morning, everyone was exhausted. But Scorsese kept asking for more takes, trying to get the perfect shot. Finally, Rickles couldn't take it anymore and said under his breath, "Marty, at this rate we'll still be here when they knock the building down." A few crew members tried not to laugh, but De Niro didn't react at all. He just stood there, completely still and focused. For the first time in his career, Don Rickles felt like his humor wasn't welcome. He finished filming his scene and then walked off the set without saying goodbye to anyone. His face was serious, and he looked straight ahead as he left. There were no jokes, no friendly waves, nothing. Later, he would say that he decided right then that he would never work in that kind of environment again. The problem wasn't really about ego or personal conflicts. It was about rhythm and energy. Comedy is all about timing and quick responses. You say something fun, people laugh, and you move on. But the style of movie making that Scorsese and De Niro used was very slow and careful. Every moment was analyzed and planned out in detail. Between takes, De Niro would go sit by himself, sometimes looking at his notes or just sitting quietly to save his energy for the next scene. Meanwhile, Rickles would look around the room for someone to joke with, trying to lighten the mood. But the atmosphere was so serious and tense that even the crew members spoke in whispers and moved carefully, as if they were afraid to disturb the concentration of the director and star. One night, Rickles tried to break the tension by making a joke directly to De Niro. He said, "Bobby, you've got the personality of a parking meter. Feed me a quarter and maybe I'll get a smile." Some of the crew members quietly chuckled, but De Niro didn't move or react at all. His stillness was almost spooky, and for the first time Rickles felt his joke fall completely flat. Not because it wasn't funny, but because there was no room for humor in that environment. From that point on, the rest of the filming was a blur of long pauses, camera adjustments, and quiet, tense energy. Rickles did his job and said his lines, but he kept his mouth shut when he felt the urge to make jokes. Inside, he had already decided that no matter how good the movie turned out to be, he would never again work in a place that killed his natural ability to make people laugh. But Rickles didn't talk about this experience publicly for many years. He kept the memory locked away like a secret. He continued his career, doing late-night TV shows, performing for sold-out audiences, and appearing at red carpet events. When interviewers asked him about difficult experiences in Hollywood, he would make a safe joke and change the subject. He never mentioned the names of the people who had made the casino experience so unpleasant. It wasn't until much later in his life that he finally opened up about what happened. He was doing a small, quiet interview with no big audience. The interviewer asked him about the toughest movie set he had ever worked on. Most people expected him to give a funny answer, maybe complaining about bad food or cramped trailers. Instead, Rickles paused for a long moment. It wasn't his usual pause before telling a joke. It was heavier and more serious. Then he said calmly, "You know, I loved Casino, but I wouldn't work with De Niro again, or under Scorsese for that matter. Not like that, not ever." These words were shocking because they were so honest and direct. This wasn't a comedy routine. Rickles went on to describe the endless retakes, the suffocating atmosphere, and how De Niro's serious attitude created a wall that no one could break through. He said, "I respect the guy. He's a great actor, but that set drained the life out of me." For someone like Rickles, who had worked with Frank Sinatra, Clint Eastwood, and Johnny Carson, to single out one collaboration as a deal-breaker was extraordinary. He didn't try to make it funny or exaggerate for effect. He spoke like someone who was tired of carrying a burden and was finally telling the truth to an old friend. But true to his nature, he couldn't resist ending the story with a little smirk, the kind of look that made you wonder if he was completely serious or just playing with the moment. That hint of uncertainty only made his revelation more interesting, because with Rickles, you could never be completely sure what was real and what was performance. Once those words were spoken, they couldn't be taken back. The shock from his confession spread through Hollywood for months. People whispered about it in dressing rooms, discussed it at industry lunches, and passed the story along like irresistible gossip. No one could quite believe that Mr. Warmth himself had finally spoken so directly about a negative experience. When Rickles made his revelation, it didn't just disappear into celebrity gossip. It stuck around. People who had worked with him for years were amazed. Here was a man who could make fun of Frank Sinatra to his face and thrive in rooms full of the biggest egos in entertainment. Yet this one movie had left such a lasting impact that he never forgot it. Hollywood insiders began sharing their own stories. Some nodded knowingly because Scorsese's movie sets were famous for being demanding and requiring perfect precision. Others were more surprised that Rickles, who seemed like he could handle anyone, had been so affected by the experience. One director supposedly said over lunch in Beverly Hills, "The surprise wasn't about whether it happened, it was about who it happened to." For some actors, working with De Niro was like a test. You had to embrace the intensity, the silence, and the focus, because that's what created great performances on screen. But Rickles came from a different world of performance. He needed the energy of a live crowd, and the unpredictable back and forth that kept things exciting. Once his comments became known, agents and casting directors began analyzing what he really meant. Was Rickles criticizing the method style of acting? Was it about respect? Or was it simply what happens when two completely different worlds collide in a high-pressure situation? No one could say for sure, and Rickles didn't seem interested in explaining further. He had dropped his bombshell and let everyone else figure out what it meant. In some circles, the story became a warning tale told to young comedians who were stepping into movie roles for the first time. The message was clear. Don't assume that working with legends will be easy. It also started quiet debates among industry veterans about whether De Niro's approach was brilliant or created a barrier to collaboration. Meanwhile, Rickles continued with his usual charm, still making jokes on late-night TV and playing to packed audiences. But if Casino ever came up in conversation, his smile would become a little tighter, as if he was remembering those long nights in Las Vegas, when even the king of comedy couldn't get a laugh. There was one more detail that Rickles only shared when pressed, and it made the entire story even stranger. During one of his later interviews, the host asked if his problem with the casino experience was personal or just about the atmosphere on set. Rickles gave a long, slow shrug and said with his trademark smirk, "Let's just say, there was one night I realized I didn't belong there. Not in that room, not in that mood." He told the story of a particularly drawn-out night when he was waiting while De Niro and Scorsese spent nearly 40 minutes debating the tiniest detail of a scene, just a barely noticeable movement of a hand. Rickles, who was used to quick, live performances, was getting restless. Finally, he spoke up and said, "Boys, at this pace I'll be needing a wheelchair before we wrap." Nobody laughed. Not De Niro, not Scorsese, not even the crew. It was as if his joke had been swallowed up by the heavy atmosphere in the room. Rickles later said that this moment was his turning point. If a movie set could be so serious that even a perfectly timed wisecrack died on impact, then it wasn't his kind of place anymore. What shocked fans most was his admission that he never watched the complete movie after it was released. In one of his final comedy specials, he joked, "Great movie from what I hear. I just skipped my scenes. I didn't want to relive the sleepless nights." The audience laughed loudly, but behind the humor was the truth. The experience had stayed with him, and not in a good way. In Hollywood, where burning bridges can end careers, Rickles never openly criticized De Niro or Scorsese. But his decision to speak, even briefly, about why he would never work with them again was a quiet act of standing up for himself. It wasn't about getting revenge. It was about drawing a line and sticking to it, even late in life. In the end, Don Rickles' revelation wasn't just about one bad experience on a movie set. It was about what kind of performer he was and what kind of performer he refused to become. His career had lasted over 60 years, and he had worked with icons in music, film, and television. He had traded jokes with Sinatra, made Johnny Carson cry with laughter, and reduced audiences of thousands to helpless giggles. Through it all, Rickles thrived on connection that was instant, unpredictable, and alive. That's what energized him and kept him sharp. When Casino came along, it seemed like it would be the perfect addition to his already legendary career. But instead of the joy of working together, Rickles found himself in a world where precision replaced spontaneity and laughter was left at the door. It wasn't wrong, it just wasn't him. And for someone who had built his life on being authentic, that was something he couldn't accept. In his later years, Rickles spoke more about the importance of protecting your own style and your own spark. He never trashed De Niro or Scorsese. In fact, he called them brilliant more than once. But he was clear that brilliance doesn't always mean compatibility. Even the greatest talents can clash, not because they dislike each other, but because they see their work in completely different ways. What made his admission so striking was how rare it was for him to break his usual showman character. Rickles was an entertainer to his core. He knew when to turn a real complaint into a laugh and when to keep a story private. That he chose to share this one at all meant it had truly left a deep impression on him. And yet, true to form, he never let the story end without leaving people guessing. Sometimes when asked about that famous night, he would lean in and whisper, "Maybe I made the whole thing up just to keep you wondering." No one ever knew if he meant it or not. That was Rickles' magic. Even when he told the truth, he made sure you walked away still thinking about it. So the man who spent his life making the world laugh left behind not just jokes, but mysteries. Was his never again statement really about De Niro and Scorsese? Or was it ultimately about himself quietly choosing where his energy belonged? We may never know for sure, and that's exactly how Don Rickles would have wanted it. Because the best punchlines are the ones you're still thinking about long after the show is over.